Now, moving to tonight's event, as I mentioned, is one that I'm extremely excited about. Our speaker for tonight is Professor Jim Costa. Now, Jim is a professor of biology and executive director of the Western Carolina University's Highlands Biological Station. He's also a research associate at Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. And he is a specialist in entomology, really focusing on insect ecology and social behavior. And he's worked everywhere from North Carolina through to South America. Now, that is, of course, his scientific portfolio, but he has an incredible record of amazing writing, focusing especially on books about Darwin, Wallace, and the history of evolutionary thinking. Now, this ranges from writing an annotated version of On the Origin of Species, as well as many, many other works, including the ones that we're going to hear about, the one we're going to hear about tonight. So with that, I think I should just hand over and let him tell us about the wonderful work he's going to talk to us about tonight. So please, Jim.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. This is, I can't think of a more special setting for celebrating Alfred Russel Wallace in this bicentennial year of his birth. It's a real special privilege, a special pleasure for me to be here with you. So thank you. And those of you joining us virtually, thank you as well for being here. You know, this institution, as many of you will know, is absolutely central to the story of Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin. I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet had a chance to view up in the library, the fabulous exhibit on precious Wallace materials. The holdings here at the Linnaean Society are just unparalleled. The notebooks, the letters. You know, please do make a point to check out the fabulous exhibition. And note too that many of these books can be sort of adopted through the Linnaean Society's adopted book, conservation program. I'd encourage you to consider adopting one of these precious books or manuscripts and help with conservation efforts going forward. Well, let me go ahead and maybe close that small window. Well, where to begin? Maybe I should begin really by thanking the Linnaean Society in another way, because my journey in exploring the life and the thought of Alfred Russel Wallace really started in the most curious way about a dozen or more years ago now. On a bus, was in fact the Oxford Tube on my way here to London when I was reading a paper by a historian named McKinney, H. Lewis McKinney, who wrote a remarkable paper about Wallace's evolutionary thinking, and was quoting at length from this notebook of Wallace's. I was just astounded. I mean, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I thought I knew, pretty well Wallace, Darwin. I knew a great deal about them, I thought. But here were some insights that I really had no idea about. And I was just increasingly excited. I was traveling with my friend, Andrew Berry, and we were heading here, as it happens, to the Linnaean Society. And I noticed that as I scanned this paper for the source of this notebook being quoted, lo and behold, it was at the Linnaean Society. And so it was absolutely, what would Wallace say? It was fate, that somehow brought me here. And I had the opportunity with Gina Douglas, with Linda Brooks, later to spend time poring over that notebook and really set me on this path of really trying to better understand, and then communicate this understanding of Alfred Russel Wallace, his relationship with fellow scientists, including his friend Charles Darwin. So it really is a very, very special pleasure and privilege to be here, standing before you some dozen years after that fateful Oxford Tube bus ride, here to the Linnaean Society. And along the way, I've had the pleasure of cooperation, the assistance of librarians here at the Linnaean Society and other institutions, but especially here at the Linnaean Society, where I was privileged to study that notebook, now known as the Species Notebook, and ultimately publish an annotated version of that and really delve into what I saw as, seriously overlooked insights into the depth and the breadth of Wallace's evolutionary thinking. So here I am. I thought that to celebrate Wallace in this bicentennial year of his birth, perhaps what better way than to maybe try to retell the story of his life, but drawing on the enormous, really, amount of literature, scholarship that's developed since the 2013 centenary of Wallace's death. Now that poses a great challenge, standing up here before you to talk about Wallace in broad strokes, because Wallace, of course, living to the age of 90, a long life, and to say it's a rich life is an understatement. I mean, the depth, the breadth of his thinking and his output. Where do we begin? I'm going to try to give you a sense of the man and his interests. This being the August scientific institution, I'm going to aim this. I'm going to give you a real sense of the development of his scientific thought, but how that intersects with his, what some would say, non-scientific interests as well. That's kind of where I'm going with this. Rather hard to condense a Wallace into a 1 hour or less, of course, presentation. 2 hour, 3 hour. So I'm going to actually begin by just kind of posing the question about, like, who is this guy anyway? Who is Wallace? And I hearken back to a quote that I came across years ago, really, by Gilbert Chesterton, that I thought was kind of intriguing at the time. Chesterton had commented in 1904 in a magazine piece, "If I were asked who ought to be regarded in future ages as the greatest man of our time," he says he would hesitate between Walt Whitman and Alfred Russel Wallace. I thought, wow, that's a really pretty interesting juxtaposition of two remarkable people, very different in many ways, or are they? Right? What's going on there? And sort of got to thinking about that, and being something of a fan of Whitman as well as of Wallace. I thought, now I'm not sure that Chesterton had this in mind, but I thought, one thing is true, right? These individuals, they celebrated the fact that they contained multitudes. Right? They were expansive in their thinking, in their philosophy. This is a quote, of course, from Whitman's Song of Myself. Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And I thought, wow, like he could have been writing that about Wallace. Wallace too contains multitudes, but Wallace too, as many of us who understand, as we've delved into understanding him, can seem to contain contradictions. So I kind of use this as a sort of starting point for exploring the remarkable Wallace. So for so many of you, you know Wallace through the scientific lens, the scientific aspects of Wallace. We honor him as the preeminent tropical biologist of his day, as of course, especially as co-discoverer of the principle of natural selection, the founder of the modern field of evolutionary biogeography. But then there's these other interests that often sort of baffled his contemporaries, his friends. Spiritualist, socialist, social reform campaigner. Are these really so different, though? In his mind, perhaps not. So the scientific works, yes, they're landmark scientific works in abundance. Geographical distribution of animals, again, that sort of establishes biogeography in an evolutionary context, understanding how geographical distribution can only be understood in terms of Earth history, geological and climatic history, but also island life, really a founding document of island biogeography. These are all very important kind of landmark works. But then there's the social and economic reform. There's the ethics. There's his spiritualism that really, again, baffled, flummoxed so many of his contemporaries. And so what we begin to see is sort of a person with broad interests that range from understanding the natural world and our place in it, but who always had a deep-seated interest in social justice, and really throughout his long life, he has a keen interest, and eventually the two interests intersect with him. We can say that by the end of his very long life, Wallace was certainly one of the most famous naturalists worldwide, with some 30 elected memberships in learned societies, bestowed with a number of medals, the Crown's highest civilian honor, the Order of Merit, honorary degrees that came from Oxford and Trinity College. Of course, Wallace, sort of pushing against the envelope and always being uneasy with privilege and kudos and accolades, turned down honorary degrees as well, including one from Cambridge University. Well, who is this guy anyway? What makes him tick? And also, why is it that we seem to have he seems to have been eclipsed? We seem to have overlooked him in some way, relative to his friend Charles Darwin. And I want to sort of better understand maybe how this happened. I won't delve into that today, but I want to also maybe use this opportunity to make a case that we need to remedy this situation. We need to do more, I think, to recognize and honor the remarkable achievements and the depth of curiosity, but also of generosity of this remarkable individual. So my talk today, my presentation will be somewhat biographical, perhaps. It will be somewhat chronological. I'll try to weave together a number of these interests, but especially with an emphasis on the scientific. And I want to start maybe at the beginning anyway for Wallace. That would be his birth, right, in the Borderlands. The Borderlands of England and Wales and South Wales, in Monmouthshire, in the small village of Usk in particular. And I think it's sort of significant. It's interesting to reflect on how, Wallace's life is marked by borderlands and boundaries and intersections of all different kinds, but literal and also metaphorical. And here we have him born in a literal borderland that was disputed territory, historically, sometimes placed in England, sometimes placed in Wales. I think that border was not really firmly set until perhaps the 1970s, that late. So I found it resonant to think about Wallace himself, born in a kind of borderland. And then I found it doubly resonant to realize that he's also born in a kind of borderland of time, right? Wallace is literally born atop a geological fault, right? The Flanbatic Fault. Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, right at the edge of a really remarkable geological formation that you can see indicated on this geological map here on the left. This is called the Usk Inlier, and this is essentially a kind of anticline structure, a buckling of the strata of the Earth into a great buckling with differential erosion of the different rock types that give you a kind of more or less concentric pattern of ridges and kind of flat areas between the ridges. And so Usk is found right along the Flanbatic Fault. And more than that, you see that the ridges that are left higher than the surrounding landscape, they in this schematic little diagram drawn here, you notice that they look rather sharp. And in fact, they are, because here's one. This is just in the back of the place of Wallace's birth. So Wallace was born in Kensington Cottage, the structure you see in the center of this photograph. And you see that it's backed right up against a very sharp bank of Silurian limestone. The geology there is very different from the geology right across the river. That's the River Usk running right in front of his house. And so, of course, being maybe something of a geology nerd on top of all the other nerdisms I'm into, I couldn't help but find that resonant as well, right? Wallace is born in a borderland twice over, curiously enough, and somehow that seemed to augur interesting things for his life of exploring and crossing and maybe erasing and redrawing borders and boundaries and lines. Humble beginnings, though, and another reason that we should really be quite impressed with Wallace in more ways than one. One being that he's very much an autodidact, a self-made individual, born to a middle-class family that nonetheless was not very prosperous. And Wallace's formal education ended at the age of 14. Thereafter, really, his education was achieved by largely himself, attending the free libraries that he could find in the mechanics institutes of the day, mechanics institute libraries and free lectures, being kind of a forerunner of the modern public library. He, by necessity, to help support himself as well as his family, he is working as first an apprentice surveyor, and later as a surveyor and a builder, spends 1 year in the town of Leicester at the age of 21, or 1 year hiatus as a school teacher. So he, humble beginnings, but it's interesting to reflect on what we see Wallace doing with his time at that time. There's some record of the sorts of books he's interested in, his literary taste that really ran from the scientific to the social and political philosophical. So certainly we know that like Darwin, right, and other naturalists of the day, I mean, Wallace is deeply impressed with, excited by the great Alexander von Humboldt, his personal narrative of travels in South America really electrified a whole generation, it's fair to say. And so this was almost, sort of required reading that any aspiring naturalist wanting to travel and explore would read, would really know whole passages of Humboldt by heart. Charles Lyell, the great geologist, Darwin himself, right, his Voyage of the Beagle that was out in 1845 in the second edition is a book that that Wallace had read. So he's quite interested in these kind of scientific questions of the day, but he's also impressed by social revolutionaries, and he specifically mentions some of these in his later writings. He was deeply impressed in his youth as a teenager with Robert Owen, the great Welsh reformer. Owen was famous for his campaigns for social reform, establishing experimental communities like in New Lanark, Scotland, New Harmony, Indiana in the US, these experimental communities where people were expected to live in cooperation with each other. Publisher of the magazine or newspaper, The New Moral World, Wallace had occasion to hear Owen speak at one point in London at one of the so-called infidels halls, where the likes of Owen would hold forth at the pulpit, and he's deeply, deeply impressed. And I do believe that there is, in the arc of Wallace's life, that Owenite socialism is absolutely in there from the beginning, because this is a keen interest. Social justice, as we would call it today, is a keen interest. And it's interesting too, Wallace is quite the religious skeptic. He was never, it's fair to say that he's never in any way orthodox. And even when he sort of strays into his spiritualism and he sort of delves into questions about the nature of the so-called spirit world and our relationship with it, or maybe there's an afterlife, it's his own brand of sort of thinking about these things. It's not orthodox sort of religion. And he comments much later on being impressed with Thomas Paine, for example, his Age of Reason. And I think it's interesting, Paine was a deist. I think in some ways, in very, very late in life, it might not be too much of a stretch to suggest that Wallace might have sort of embraced some of those deistical sorts of views. Hard to say, it's very interesting. But I do want to come back to maybe the intersection of the scientific and the social by pointing out Wallace's keen interest in this book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, 1844, published anonymously, and only much later was the author revealed to be the Scottish publisher and author, Robert Chambers. And so the Vestiges was really something of a semi-scientific, but also somewhat social commentary sort of tract, where Chambers is speculating about the evolution that, as we would call it today, transmutation at all levels, cosmological, to geological, to zoological, and even political, right? Thinking about the way that this impacts people and societies. And knowing that this would be received as a scandalous tract, I mean, he wisely kind of published it anonymously. And it says something about Wallace, and this kind of speaks to the title of my book, right? Radical by Nature, the Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace. I'm fascinated by how readily Wallace will embrace these kind of what others would consider to be really radical or fringe notions. And so it may say something then that the 22-year-old Wallace, upon reading the Vestiges, not in 1844, but the next year, 1845, immediately sort of, grasp that idea, transmutation. It must be correct. It must be accurate. This idea that would have been considered to be anathema to most respectable naturalists was really, some would say heretical, some would simply say scandalous, or at least unphilosophical. But here he is embracing this idea. And I think it plants a seed. It's fair to say it plants a seed. What do I mean by that? Well, fortunately for us, literature, the documentary literature, the letters and manuscripts of this time survive. And we find that in 1844, that one year that Wallace worked in Leicester as a school teacher, fatefully, that year he met up with a kindred spirit. He met a young Henry Walter Bates, who was an ardent insect collector, and introduced Wallace to the joys of insect collecting. And when Wallace moved away at the end of that year, the two kept up a correspondence, and it's really just so fortunate that they did, right? Instead of just living in the same town and conversing, they were forced to write to each other, and fortunately, these letters survive. Right. So we know that, for example, there is a letter dated the 9th of November, 1845, where Wallace asked his buddy, have you read Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, or is it out of your line? And clearly, he wasn't happy with Bates's answer. That doesn't survive. We don't have his answer, but we do have Wallace's response to the answer. And this is the letter, right? Because this has been published, and it's also available through the Wallace Correspondence Project, where Wallace says, I have a more favorable opinion of the Vestiges than you appear to have. I don't consider it a hasty generalization, but rather as an ingenious hypothesis, strongly supported by striking facts. And it kind of goes on and on. Their letters back and forth, they're often sort of addressing these sort of philosophical questions. And I want to mention that specifically, because I think too often Wallace can be dismissed as really an excellent collector. He's a wonderful collector. And boy, did he just get lucky. He stumbled onto natural selection and now he's famous. No, absolutely not the case. Right? We have evidence of Wallace's keen interest in these philosophical questions, and few questions were of greater philosophical interest to naturalists of the day, especially of a biological, persuasion, than the question of the origin of species, the nature of species, the nature of varieties, the question of whether species can actually change, right? What they call transmutation, we call evolution today. And so, just to sort of look at one other letter very, very quickly, a couple of years later, right, 2 years later, Wallace writes to Bates that he is dissatisfied, apparently, with a mere local collection, quote unquote, talking about sort of a collection of an insect group. He'd like to thoroughly study some very widely distributed group. Why, though? Principally with a view to the theory of the origin of species. Right? It doesn't get much clearer than that. He's quite interested in this remarkable question about the nature of species. And so he concludes, by that means, he says to Bates, I am strongly of opinion that some definite results might be arrived at. Well, this is very interesting because timing-wise, because really just half a year later, right, these two young guys, I mean, think of it, these two young guys, right, with very little by way of formal education, really very little by way of resources, no money, right, no social connection, no connection with any institution, no great museum or university, they actually contrive a plan to travel to South America to be collectors, naturalists that will travel through, some of the most beautiful and bio-rich regions of the world, making observations, and they will sell that in London through a very able agent. They will sell duplicate specimens, and that will fund their travels. And in the meantime, though, Wallace is always keeping additional material, right? Has duplicates of everything. He's amassing his personal collection that he's going to use. I think it refers right back to that comment that he made to Bates, right? To study one family thoroughly, principally with the view to the theory of the origin of species. And so while they're at it, these naturalists in paradise, Wallace spending 4 years, Bates ultimately spent 11 years traveling in South America. Diversity, geographical distribution, geological observations, ethnological observations, You can just imagine the sort of stack of notebooks, right, that he's just cramming with all sorts of fascinating material. I want to emphasize again, I like to say Wallace did not travel in order to be a collector, right? He collected in order to fund his travels. And why did he want to travel? Right? He's keenly interested in the grand questions. And I think that says a lot. I mean, it's pretty audacious for, you know, a couple of young guys with all of the disadvantages that I mentioned to you, to actually undertake such a bold enterprise. Really quite remarkable. So Wallace in particular, after about the first year, the two go their separate ways. They're collecting in different areas, and Wallace goes upriver, up the Rio Negro, up the Rio Wallaces. Wallace, of course, the surveyor, is surveying as he goes, and there's, you know, this enormous hand-drawn, hand-drafted map, very detailed map of these rivers. This is just a fraction of it that survives in the Natural History Museum here in London. And he is, you know, making observations. These are some of the surviving drawings of Wallace's. He's keenly interested in palms. He makes ethnological observations. He's meeting with indigenous people, the Banawa and other peoples way upriver. He is drawing fish and then promptly eating them afterwards. And I say, though, that these are some of the surviving drawings. And I made reference a moment ago to, wow, wouldn't it be something if we knew something about like the piles of notebooks that Wallace must have been filling with all kinds of observations. Well, so unfortunately, however, some of you here no doubt are aware that that those notebooks that surely existed do not survive, right? So after 4 years of trials and tribulations, an enormous amount of work, and maybe almost 2 years of specimens actually held up in the customs house and ready to go home, he's ill with malaria. He suffered the loss very tragically of his youngest brother, who came to South America to help him and succumbed to yellow fever and died. Horrible, you know, just, you know, these burdens that he has. He's finally ready to go home in 1852, and some weeks out, he suffers the catastrophic loss, right, of everything, almost everything, right? The few pictures I showed you, right, some sketches of palms, some drawings of fish, essentially it. And I thought I would maybe read you just a little bit about this this remarkable episode, if I may, because I really try to picture in my mind's eye, just imagine it, you know, and then he said they're adrift in a lifeboat, no prospect of being saved. Death looms large, right? He's lost everything. You know, he had a live menagerie. He had his notebooks. He had, you know, years of specimens, you know. So chapter 6 opens, he slowly circled the towering funeral pyre that was his ship, an unspeakable calamity, the enormity of which had not yet registered. Nearly 4 weeks out from Belém, the weather fine and making good time, the captain caught a whiff of smoke one day after breakfast and asked Wallace to go investigate with him. The merchant vessel was carrying a large quantity of India rubber and balsam of Capivi, an essential oil obtained from leguminous rainforest trees, then as now a prized ingredient in varnishes and ointments. Prone to combustion, kegs of this oil are most safely packed in damp sand. Captain Turner's first mistake was packing them in rice chaff. The heat of friction from the ship's incessant motion soon ignited the oil in the already sweltering hold. But it may have slowly smoldered on in that airless space had the captain not made his second mistake. He and the mates foolishly fed the fire life-giving oxygen by opening hatches and cutting holes in the deck as they investigated the source of the smoke. In minutes, the fire roared to life, and by noon had gone from smolder to inferno, sending the crew scrambling to deploy the 2 lifeboats, a longboat with sails and a smaller gig, neither much used and riddled with gaps between the planks, desiccated from years baking in the tropical sun. The call came to abandon ship, and the crew was in a frenzy of activity. Wallace makes it down into the lifeboat, skinning his hands badly as he slides down the rope, and he's stunned. He was sitting there in the bottom of the boat. Now Wallace and the crew watched, stunned from the comparative safety of the bobbing boats as the insatiable fire steadily consumed the ship. The shrouds and sails browned, then blackened, then burst into flame. The burning mainmast of the rolling ship snapped about 20 feet up, while the foremast, a pillar of flame, landed an hour more. Flames leapt from the hatches. The decks were a massive fire. The bulwarks broke off and fell flaming into the sea with a hiss. Most of his menagerie was dead by now. Or, the doomed survivors kind of out there, just kind of, frantically, trying to make sense of it all before succumbing to the flames. So it goes on. It goes on, and Wallace and the others were adrift for about 10 days, and are very, very lucky to have been rescued, although that ship almost wrecked as well, actually. But it's very interesting to note that despite all the provisions, right, this is the glass half full Wallace, right? This is the Wallace that is describing the ordeal, but can't help but manage that being on his back in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic had its advantages. What a great place for observing meteors, given the timing, these were the Perseids, no doubt. He was really enjoying the show. But I want to also emphasize that although I did sort of mention, I underscored the losses, I find it remarkable that despite those losses, what Wallace was able to produce in the year after, right? So bear in mind, all the while he's exploring, he is writing papers and detailed letters and sending them back to London. And some of them are published, some of them are read before the learned societies. So he's got material to draw from. So consider this, in 1853 alone, right, that 1 year, he manages to publish, despite losing so much, not one, but 2 books, right? A book of poems and his travel narrative, his travels in South America, plus 7 papers that he read before various learned societies. That's pretty amazing, right? Pretty remarkable that he's able to pull that off. I want to draw your attention to just a couple of things that we can glean from some of these writings, because, as I mentioned how he's lost virtually everything. Tantalizingly, there must have been fabulous notebooks full of all kinds of interesting insights lost, right? So we gain a little bit of insight into his evolutionary thinking from some of the surviving papers and other publications, his books. And so I'll just draw your attention to one, I think, telling comment that appears in his paper on the habits of butterflies of the Amazon Valley, and specifically the heliconius butterflies. This is a group that's especially rich in closely related species and varieties. Many of them are highly restricted in their range. And it struck him that they often seem to be found in areas that he reckoned were geologically very recent or young. And so in his paper, he makes this comment that I thought is interesting. We may fairly regard those insects, which are peculiar to geologically young areas, as among the youngest of species, the latest in the long line or the long series of modifications which the forms of animal life have undergone. That's yet another statement of Wallace's commitment, his full embrace of this kind of heretical notion of transmutation, of change of species, right? The modifications that the forms of life have undergone. Now, Wallace does, of course, survive. He does make it home. Here he's reunited with his sister, with his mother, and he comments that 50 times since he left the shores of Brazil, he vowed, if I once reached England, I will never trust myself more to the ocean. But of course, he does. Vows are meant to be broken, I guess. I don't know. 18 months later, maybe because he did lose so much in South America, he's now heading east. He arrives in 1854 in the great Melee Archipelago, largely modern day Indonesia, parts of Malaysia, parts of New Guinea, but the world's greatest, largest archipelago. But I want to point out to you that it says something that less than a year after arriving in the East, Wallace wrote another stunning paper, very, very interesting paper that could only have been written in that time frame if it is something that had been gestating for quite a long time before. And this is now known by biologists, by historians and others as the so-called Sarawak Law paper on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species, where he has propositions in sort of geology, paleontology, in geographical distribution. He kind of puts these patterns together. He connects the dots, and he concludes that every species has come into existence coincident in space and time with a pre-existing, closely allied species. Again, a little bit oblique, but a sort of transmutational statement. The idea being that species are arising in immediate proximity to a closely related existing species. And of course, connecting those dots, you get the idea that the one is derived from the other. So of course, he has now for a long time this transmutational notion. And he realizes that this simple observation, right, that really had eluded everybody, connects together, he said, and renders intelligible a vast number of independent and hitherto unexplained facts, right? So he's sort of onto something, but he has no real mechanism. And this is where, so while the notebooks of South America are lost, we're so fortunate that the notebooks of his Eastern travels survive, and that most of them are right here in the wonderful Linnaean Society of London. This is the notebook in particular that I find the most interesting, the Species Notebook, which contains extensive arguments, Wallace's extensive arguments for transmutation, and his plans to actually write a book arguing for that, which is really quite astounding. And former historians like McKinney have noted that this long section that begins here on page 35, Note for Organic Law of Change, speculate that he might have entitled his book on the organic law of change. And when I had the privilege of studying and ultimately publishing a transcription and annotation of that notebook with the help of the Linnaean Society here, I used McKinney's title, On the Organic Law of Change. It's just chock full of fascinating evolutionary insights. And I want to just make the point that we can see Wallace's strategy here. He is really speaking to the geologist Charles Lyell, who would have been recognized as the leading opponent of the idea of species change. And in fact, Lyell's attack on the idea of transmutation in the famous Principles of Geology, that was taken as the definitive statement on the matter by many, right? It was sort of settled then. Transmutation cannot happen. And yet, of course, Wallace, the iconoclast, the radical, the revolutionary, kind of pushing against that envelope, he's convinced that Lyell is wrong. And so in his notebook, he writes out passages from Lyell and then rebuts them. One after another, he writes out Lyell's arguments and then rebuts them. And I wanted to sort of quickly show you, really in a kind of graphical way, a tabular way maybe, how remarkably parallel Wallace's investigations are with Darwin's own investigations. Of course, the two are unknown to each other, what they're actually interested in and working on beyond simply the species question. So we have, for example, here on the left side column, you see Wallace in his Species Notebook, a whole range of observations relating to transmutation, and then Darwin in various works and how they often correspond to the very same points being made. And the list kind of goes on: geology and paleontology, instinct and habit, humans, the human-primate relationship and the nature of human variation, geographical distribution, comparative anatomy, morphology, affinities, as they would have called them then. The list goes on and on. I just find it, just striking how parallel they are in their investigations. These are the many lines of investigation that Darwin so fruitfully tied together in The Origin. And here we see Wallace trying to do the same, tying together these myriad observations. This was an analysis that I had presented in another book that came out of my study of the Species Notebook, Wallace, Darwin, and the Origin of Species. So around this time, as Wallace is working on these philosophical questions, he actually does succeed in hitting upon the mechanism of species change. I call this breaking the species barrier. Species immutability was the assumption, right? Species cannot change was the assumption. And in a malarial fit, as Wallace relates, in the village of Dodinga on the island of Halmahera, when he is well enough and he's sort of able to sort of write down coherently his ideas, he pens an essay This is called the Ternate essay because it was sent from his base on the neighboring island of Ternate. And notice the title of his essay, On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type, right? Varieties to depart indefinitely, become more and more dissimilar from the parental type. This is, of course, a description of an evolutionary process. And it's a whole other talk that we won't get into to really discuss the details of the circumstances of Wallace's sending faithfully this essay to Darwin from the island of Ternate, where it was received in probably about mid-June of 1858, the delicate arrangement of the reading of Darwin's unpublished writings, along with Wallace's essay on the 1st of July, 1858. So what is that, 165 years? Tomorrow, right? 165 years. Wow. Not in this room, but we're going to visit that room. I'm very excited. And of course, Darwin very much under the gun, to establish his priority some year and a half later, publishing this magnum opus on the origin of species. And when Wallace finally receives his personal copy sent to him, he's still in the Melee Archipelago. He has nothing but the highest of praise for Darwin and his achievement, right? The force of admiration can no further go, right? And this actually marks the beginning of what is to become a lifelong friendship between the two. It's sometimes strained, as we will see. I want to also point out that I think sometime in mid to late 1858, Darwin sent to Wallace the outline of his book in progress. The book title at that time was Natural Selection. Only later did it become On the Origin of Species. Wallace, in his species notebook, wrote out the table of contents that you see here. Right, so this is essentially the kind of table of contents of the origin as well, with some minor changes. So Wallace at this point seems to have just abandoned his own book plan. He just kind of gave it up. Darwin did it. He, highest praise, no need for me to weigh in on the subject. Who would have to, why try to convince people of transmutation? Darwin did it, right? I do think it's a pity that he didn't articulate his own vision in his own book at that time. It would have been fascinating. He returns now a couple of years later, 1862, and he declared, now 8 years he has spent crisscrossing that vast archipelago. He called this the central and controlling incident of his life. Throughout much of that time, he had the able assistance of Ali, a young Malay man who proved to be his most trusted companion, nursing him through illnesses, a collector, organizing sort of affairs, just as a close companion. And when Wallace left the archipelago, he had this portrait made of Ali to remember him by. In all that time, those 8 years, landmark discoveries, selection, Wallace's Line, and more. And I want to just kind of drill in a little bit and kind of give you a sense of Wallace that is sort of, at the height, perhaps, of his fame as a naturalist. He's really making it, right, as you can imagine. Early on in the travels, right, Wallace trying to get to the far east, trying to get to the Aru Islands, has to kind of zig and zag his way. He visits the island of Bali, and short time thereafter, he visits the island of Lombok, and he is observant enough to realize that the fauna, the bird, the avifauna, the mammalian fauna are radically different despite the close proximity of these two islands. And he really cottons onto this in a very serious way. In the modern understanding, right, we can understand that as sea level rises and falls with climatic cycling, like glacial periods, for example, depth of ocean can make all the difference with respect to whether certain islands are united as sea level falls. As you see here in the top diagram, kind of a large peninsula of Asia that is made of Sumatra and Borneo and peninsular Malaysia. But on the other side of this archipelago, we have New Guinea united with Australia. And yet we have very, very deep waters and swift currents in between. And so Wallace sort of realizes that Earth history, in this case, climatic history, is playing a role in shaping the geographical distribution of these species. And he begins to map this out across the archipelago. He maps this out rather carefully. And now that he's home, he's back in London and poring over his notes. He publishes this 1863. 5 years later, Thomas Henry Huxley dubbed this the Wallace Line, right? Wallace's Line, that is the demarcation between the Australasian and the Indo-Malayan biogeographic realms, two of the 6 great biogeographic realms of the planet, right? Now, I want to also mention, in this period, this is a period of ferment, the 1860s, a period of ferment for Wallace. 1864, he proposes a remarkable model of human evolution, physical and mental evolution. He reads this to before the Anthropological Society, and essentially his model holds that humans, of course, diverged from a primate ancestor and begin to change physically, but there is a point where selection begins to increasingly operate on the mind, and you have attenuated selection on the body to the point where humans physically are almost in a freeze frame, and the mind continues to develop. And maybe associated anatomical features, maybe faculties of speech, and maybe our manual dexterity change as well. He has this remarkable idea of selection operating in 2 phases on humans. So we represent a kind of sort of frozen selection acting on the body, but our minds have expanded. Our cognitive capacity is just astonishing, right? And much of our success as a species is due to that fact. Well, Darwin is just bowled over by this, right? Darwin writes to Wallace, the great leading idea is quite new to me, he says, that during late ages, the mind would have been modified more than the body. He's really impressed. In fact, he works this into his second most important book, The Descent of Man, 1871, chapter 7, describes Wallace's model, or he adopts this model of human evolution. At this time, too, it's sort of one sort of incredible paper after another. 1865, Wallace publishes a long paper on the phenomena of variation and geographical distribution illustrated by the Papilianans, the swallowtails of the Malayan region, he says. In this remarkable paper, right, he's clarifying definitions of variety, species, geographical subspecies. He's explaining how selection can produce parallel evolution, including mimicry. Darwin is puzzled over the phenomenon of bright coloration in caterpillars, and he can't quite figure it out. He's thinking about sexual selection, but caterpillars are immature stages of butterflies and moths. So how could sexual selection act on caterpillars? He asks Bates what he thinks. Bates says, I don't know. Why don't you ask Wallace, So he does, and Wallace sort of characteristically hits the nail on the head, and essentially the concept of aposematic coloration, warning coloration, is born, right? Bates is quite right, Darwin says to Wallace, you're the man to apply to in a difficulty. I never heard anything more ingenious than your suggestion, he says. In Descent, he also related this story, and he talked about Wallace's innate genius for solving difficulties. In this period, too, Wallace marries, right? He marries Annie Mitten, who is the daughter of a moth specialist, a bryologist. They begin to start a family. They ultimately have 3 children, and sadly, only 2 of those 3 survive to adulthood. But they're born 1867, and their daughter 1869, and their older son, William, 1871. So this is a tremendous period. Wallace in the ascent, he's starting a family. He is recognized by his fellow naturalists of London Scientific Society as a person of just absolutely remarkable acumen. He culminates that decade with the triumphant publication of the Melee Archipelago, 1869, this best-selling travel memoir. Structurally, it's quite interesting the way he kind of presented his travels. This bestseller was dedicated to Darwin, who was really deeply touched. And Darwin wrote to Wallace and said, this is a thing for my children's children to be proud of, right? He really was deeply moved by that. So all of this is happening in the 1860s, but then something else also happens in the very late 1860s. And that is suddenly Wallace seemingly re-erecting this barrier between humans and the rest of the natural world, right? After he had discovered natural selection and he tore down that barrier, and we understand human evolution in the same terms as any other organism, what's going on with Wallace? Well, Wallace had about the mid-1860s been turned on to the spiritualist movement, right? Which is not to say he was spiritual, right, in a sort of conventional religious sense. He's interested in spiritualism and the movement that held that there might be a kind of alternate sort of reality, a kind of spirit realm. And it kind of began to raise questions. Wallace is always kind of interested in properties of the mind and like mesmerism, and he's sort of thinking that there may be something to this, there may be something going on, and he thinks that maybe this is where he begins to marry this interest with his Owenite socialism, the idea of human perfectibility. Maybe this is actually the way that human society slowly but surely improves, progresses over the centuries, the millennia. So he came to believe that the brain, after all, couldn't evolve by Darwinian Wallacean gradualism, because he says, look, the most complex mental faculties were and are, right, of no use to humans in a so-called primitive state, right? Think about hunter-gatherers, perhaps. And yet all humans, even hunter-gatherers, have exactly the same tremendous capacity of cognition as anybody else. Right. So this is quite a departure from many of his contemporary thinkers that often saw a kind of hierarchy, rather Eurocentric, ethnocentric, kind of seeing, European civilization as kind of the pinnacle and the achievements made possible by certain properties of mind that other peoples lacked, that sort of thing. Not Wallace, right? Not Wallace. He sees everybody as having exactly the same capacities and exactly the same moral worth as well. But you can imagine how well this went over, right, with Charles Darwin and friends. Because Wallace is very much part of the circle, right? So Darwin bitterly writes to Wallace, "I hope you've not murdered too completely your own and my child," he says. And then, he writes again, so mad, and he says, "As you expected, I differ grievously from you," he says, "and I'm very sorry for it." Darwin really respected Wallace enormously, and it really worried him that they were sort of not on the same page when it came to this issue. This, maybe it's fair to say, severely strained in some measure their relationship, but absolutely never broke their friendship, right? In the meantime, even as Darwin, Lyell, Hooker, Huxley, and others befriended Wallace and admire Wallace, even as they're just sort of perplexed by this interest in spiritualism and what they consider to be Wallace's great gullibility, they marvel at his intellectual achievements in science. I mentioned earlier, geographical distribution of animals, a founding document of modern evolutionary biogeography, island life, a founding document of modern island biogeography, Wallace's innovative techniques of mapping, right? He's ever the inveterate mapper. He comes up with all sorts of neat techniques to map geographical distribution, these beautifully developed maps of the world. In the mid-1880s, Wallace has a triumphant tour across North America, right? His American tour. He kicks off his opening lecture at the Lowell Institute in Boston. And you can see that in the newspaper account the next day, he's hailed as the first Darwinian. The first Darwinian Wallace did not leave a leg for anti-Darwinism to stand on, right? And it kind of went on, in the East, he's meeting with leading naturalists. He's at one point invited to the White House, probably a somewhat uneasy tea with Grover Cleveland, who really wasn't very interested in science at all, right? And then out west, some kindred spirits like John Muir, spending time kind of communing with Muir among the big trees, which deeply impressed Wallace out in California, botanizing with Alice Eastwood in California, and then also again in Colorado, right? The remarkable Alice Eastwood, documenting in a detailed kind of travel diary all of these wonderful adventures. So let's just say, Wallace, you can understand why people have seen him as kind of these contradictory Wallaces. He is the first Darwinian, he is the devastatingly effective defender of the Darwinian Wallacean tradition. He is probably more effective in some ways than even T.H. Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. And even Huxley, who was a big buddy of Wallace's, just sort of applauded his ability to just, eviscerate, opponents, whether it was, usually it's in his writing, right? He's incredibly prolific, hundreds of papers and letters. He's lauded as an original theorist. I mentioned natural selection, of course, warning coloration. There are others, what we would call today reinforcement and speciation, what we would call today the kind of honest signaling model of sexual selection. This is another area where he disagreed with Darwin, and the modern view of sexual selection, it's fair to say, is rather closer to Wallace's view than Darwin's view. His travel memoir, it goes on, right? But then at the same time, he's a thorn in the side of the scientific establishment. His spirited, let's say, advocacy for spiritualism, he's attacking compulsory smallpox vaccination, not because he's some kind of an anti-vaxxer in the modern sense, but more that he's concerned that the data aren't clear how beneficial it is, and he's really concerned about individual autonomy, individual rights, and the compulsion really bothered him. Right? He criticizes public support for natural history museums. What? It's like biting the hand that feeds you. See, it's talking about. And he is the founding president of the Land Nationalization Society. In 1888, Wallace actually declares himself a thorough socialist. He had always been, in my estimation, an Owenite socialist. Now he is sort of, he goes public and he says, I am a thorough socialist. And he writes really just remarkable attacks on the establishment, like this comment from his autobiography, to allow one child to be born a millionaire and another a pauper is a crime against humanity, he says. And for those who believe in a deity, a crime against God, right? Those are very strong words. Notice this calling card where he writes, wishing yourself in the cause of socialism, every success. Believe me, yours very truly. So I want to just sort of mention at last here, Wallace's intersection of his science and his social issues, his social interests, let's say. And this is where he actually does a bit of an about face on sexual selection. And he actually adopts the novelist Edward Bellamy's idea, kind of a curious notion, that if we could just liberate women in our society and give them the vote, give them full legal and economic freedom, then actually, and they're not simply marrying by necessity, which so many were for so many centuries, right, for millennia, that this could actually unleash a form of sexual selection that will ultimately improve all of society. Perhaps, of course, a rather naive view, but sincere for all of that. He writes these two long essays arguing for this, human selection and human progress, past and future. He's explicitly rejecting eugenics, especially this kind of coercive negative form of eugenics, of the kind that Francis Galton and others might have advocated, right? He's embracing equality, abolition of poverty through radical, there's that word again, land and economic reform, right? Land nationalization, right? And women's suffrage, economic and political liberation of women. So this is kind of, where he's going in the 1890s. He is a humanitarian. He is the archetypal, socially engaged scientist, right? He fully embraces his science in the service of his social interests, right? So I say here, he's socially engaged, but he's sure no socialite. He hates being, kind of in sort of the niceties of polite society and all of that. He's campaigning for women's suffrage, for using some modern terms here, conservation. He's anti-eugenics. He's advocating for, on behalf of the labor movement, like the 8-hour workday, for example, regulation of food and drugs, land reform. It goes on and on and on. So much could be said. And I thought I would just give you one, I think there's one letter in particular of Wallace's that, that actually says a lot about his interests there in the 1890s into the early 2000s. And I thought I would just share that with you if I can find it very quickly. This is a letter that Wallace wrote to his daughter, Violet. You see here Annie, his wife, on the left, and Violet is on the right, and possibly Will, their son, took the photo. Not clear if that's true. This is the early 1900s, about the time he would have built his final home, Old Orchard, the kind of final frontiers, I think of it, in Broadstone. And so I start this chapter saying Violet was annoyed. She was annoyed with her dad. He was a miserable correspondent, she berated, her letters languishing for weeks unanswered. And so in his defense, her father wrote, "My dear Violet, if you had letters almost every day about Darwinism, spiritualism, vaccination, socialism, traveling, dog's tails, cat whiskers, glaciers, orchids, etc., and had books sent to you on all these subjects to acknowledge and read and request for information on other subjects and other subjects and other subjects, and a book to write and a garden to attend to, and 4 orchid houses and chess to play and visitors to see and calls to make and plants to name and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, well, perhaps you would be a miserable letter writer too." It was true enough. It was late 1896, and he was busier than ever. At nearly 74 years old, the sage of Dorset, his advice and opinions sought on all manner of subjects, many of which he said, "I know nothing except general principles, and those go a long way with the ignorant." Yes, he was swamped, and he pleaded special dispensation from Violet, signing off, "Your affectionate and much abused Pa." So finally, pushing the envelope to the very end, again, Wallace's scientific life and his interest in what we might say are non-scientific interests, there is no clear kind of line of delineation between the two. And we see that in terms of his output there, right to the very end. 1913, the year of Wallace's death, he publishes 2 books, Revolt of Democracy, you've got an idea where he's going with that one, right? Social Environment and Moral Progress. And in this book, he actually elaborates on his theory of giving women the vote and liberating them in terms of the ability of sexual selection to improve society. But then we also have the surviving handwritten outline to Wallace's, what would have been, I think, Wallace's last book. Right, his last book, Never Realized. And I'm very happy to say, thanks to Isabelle Trementier, who did and others, right, who put together the fabulous exhibit up in the library, this manuscript is on display, so you must check it out. This book was to have been called Darwin and Wallace, right, a study of their literary and scientific writings. But here's what I find most interesting about this outline, right? The last chapter, right, chapter 8, this is showing Wallace ready as ever to do battle, right? Here in chapter 8, he is going to explain the theory of natural selection as it stands, its chief upholders in Europe and America, and then he notes no important difference among Darwinians, but then he's going to do battle, right, with mutationism and Mendelianism, right? The Neo-Lamarckians, the mutationists of the De Vriesian school, the early Mendelians, right? Early Mendelism thought to be actually undermining Darwinian and Wallacean gradualism. This he's going to say, notice he says in his outline here, totally inadequate. This gives you an idea where that chapter is going, right? He's gonna do battle. This is the card published in advance by John Murray, the publisher. This book would have been released in spring of 1915, and the last Wallace had died in 1913. And I had the privilege of the good fortune to study this manuscript, and George Beccaloni and I actually published a kind of analysis of this manuscript, and I give you the reference here at the lower left, Notes and Records. This just came out in April. It's a fascinating document. So I hope that I've maybe succeeded somehow in giving you this kind of, bold strokes, kind of big picture sense of Wallace's intellectual trajectory, what makes him tick, his interests, the way in which he took his scientific and less than scientific interests and married them in fascinating ways. And really, my efforts here, I kind of harken back. I harken back to the idea that Wallace is multitudinous. And I want to just leave you with one final very brief little reading here. And That is because not only am I struck by Whitman's words, I'm struck by how similar they look also. Whitman and Wallace. So the Wallace line is an apt metaphor for the many explorations of borderland and boundary that we've seen crisscrossing Wallace's remarkable life, biogeographical and geological, certainly. But there also exists the Wallace line of science and society, humans and nature, physical and spirit worlds, rich and poor, civilized and savage, privileged and powerless, Wallace's time and our time. Indeed, Alfred Russel Wallace is a thinker and role model for our times and beyond, for the ages. His life of curiosity, adventure, genius, discovery, and advocacy inspired and inspiring in equal measure. Like Walt Whitman, he contained multitudes with a largeness of spirit and a diversity of perspectives and experiences that embraced even self-contradiction at times. And that's okay. Like Whitman too, Wallace beckons to us still from some borderland being, metamorphosed in a way perhaps Ovid would appreciate. And I quote Whitman here, "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You'll hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nonetheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you." And we would do well, I think, to keep searching for Alfred Russel Wallace and try to better and better understand him, and that the depth, the breadth of his spirit, of his philosophy, of his scientific and other achievements. And with that, I want to thank you all. And of course, I want to thank a multitude really of friends, of family, of funding agencies and organizations, of institutions like the wonderful Linnean Society of London that have made my studies possible. So thank you.